The session the plenary session 5 is on South Asia value chain, and as you might noticed from Vice President's speech till discussion in the last special event, that value chain is coming repeatedly. So this is the plenary session 5, and this 5 plenary session will be chaired by none other than Rajive Kumar. Dr. Rajive Kumar is Senior Fellow, Center for Policy Research. The lead presentation, Vaqar Ahmed could not come, so Dr. Abid Suleri will make the presentation. Yes. Then panelists will be Professor S.K. Mahanti from RIS, and Dr. Keshav Das from GIDR, Professor Ajit Rai Chaudhary from Jadavpur University, Dr. Rajak from Commonwealth Secretariat, and Mr. Pradeep Sristha is the Managing Director, Panch Kenya Group in Kathmandu. All their biodata and CVR are all in your folder. Please look at that. So we have 5 panelists, 1 lead presentation, and the chairperson. So time is for 1 hour 30 minutes. So the allotment of time for lead presentations 10 to 15 minutes. Our panelists will restrict in the 10 minutes time. Then we can have some time for Q&A, and we break a coffee at 10:30. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Pradeep, sorry, and good morning, everybody. It's great to see that the South Asia Economic Summit grows from strength to strength, not from this plenary session at the moment, but from what I saw the last 2 days, and that's a great sign. At least one part of the South Asian community sticks to its guns and carries forward the flag and flies the flag, and we, the economists, have done it. My first paper on South Asia Regional Cooperation was, I think, in 1985. So we are soldiering on. We are, and we will not give up, as it were. And a great session this morning, and a wonderful and amazing panel. And I read the background paper carefully yesterday, and I think that's been very well done. I need a favor from all of us, which is that I have to be at another session at 10:30. So can I make a request that we end this one 5 minutes earlier with your cooperation at 10:25, with the cooperation of all my panelists as well. So that I'll be really, and therefore being the chairperson, our main job is always to be a good timekeeper. So which is what I will be, I assure you, and then we can take it from there. 2 very brief remarks I want to make before I hand it over to Abid Saab for his presentation of the background paper, the lead presentation. One, that the South Asia value chain, which is the topic of this panel, clearly is going to be the future. It is the next step that South Asia needs to take to develop intra-industry trade, as has happened in Southeast Asia and the rest of Asia, East Asia, etc. So therefore it's congratulations for having this forward-looking discussion this morning. But the 2 preconditions for that, as far as I can see, is 1, the development of infrastructure in South Asia, because intra-industry trade, production networks, all of that are premised upon that there is the required infrastructure for export-oriented industries. So which are the infrastructure of ports and conclaves and industrial estates and energy and power, etc. All of that. And I think Richard Baldwin and Hookman make this amazing point, which we had them about a year ago, that once you have that infrastructure and given the intra-industry trade and production networks, comparative advantage ceases to be very relevant in any country. And we need to go forward from there. And I see a lot of merit in that argument, which is that if you are a part of a supply chain, and if you're going to supply components and or assembly or whatever, then to talk about countries' comparative advantages in that global trading framework is probably passé. So we need to move on from there and focus much more on infrastructure. And the second point that I wanted to make was simply that, of course, intra-industry trade would not happen if you've got a whole panoply of differentiated tariff and non-tariff barriers. And in fact, if there is a whole overlapping regime where each country has 5-6 different preferential treatments with each other, and the other, then that creates a confusion, the spaghetti sort of bowl, which also militates against intra-industry. So maybe the discussion among our panelists, if they so think that these 2 points are of relevance, could veer around to those 2 areas or to those 2 dimensions about how to promote South Asian value chains in the future. With those very few words, I will not impose another introduction of my panelists on you. It's all there in this very well prepared profile of participants. So I will, and I hope my panelists won't mind that I will not introduce you again. Everybody could do that. So with those few words, could I hand it over to Dr. Abid Suleri for the lead presentation. Suleri sir.
Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much, Dr. Rajive, for setting the scene. And the thoughts that we wanted to share on behalf of SDPI, it's about South Asia value chain prospects and challenge. Originally, our Deputy Executive Director, Dr. Vaqar, he was supposed to make this presentation, but one of us had to be in Pakistan and one of us has to be here. So finally, I came here and he had to stay back. But this paper was jointly prepared. Vaqar was taking care of the current situation. He was taking care of review of literature. And my job was to present way forward. So obviously, I'll just focus on the last slides, way forward, but I'll just try to take along. And taking a clue from Dr. Rajive Kumar. You see, when we look at the whole process of regional or global value chain, apart from the 3 documented advantages of being part of any supply chain, efficiency enhancement in production or improved production techniques, reduced logistic expenditures, the most relevant thing that we found in South Asia context is our mindset of import substitution, and is our mindset how to somehow defend imports, because many a times we feel that if a country is a net importer or a country's the trade balance is not in favor of a country, we feel that perhaps, as we heard yesterday in the business panel, that once India granted Pakistan MFN status, the trade was no more in favor of Pakistan. So we wanted to challenge this mindset and try to see that if it depends on imports, and if we want to be part of a regional supply chain, we can import for re-export, of course, after value addition, and that's the political economy of choices. So import is not always bad, and import will not be bad provided the importers they can be part of any supply chain. Then the literature is full of positive relation between GDP and growth of global value chain. UNCTAD study on a global value chain, which are relatively more beneficial to developing economies, those are already there. Some of the studies that we found more relevant and more useful, and of course many of the authors and co-authors they are present in this very room. The study by Commonwealth Secretariat and UNCTAD, where they found the potential of Pakistan, Bangladesh, India and Sri Lanka at 6-digit level, that how they can be part of supply chains, and they had identified almost 1,000 products where these countries can possibly undertake the mutual trade and enhance competition. For example, when we look at textile and clothing sector, so Pakistan can supply cotton yarn and fabrics. Bangladesh is a leading garment exporter and has developed backward spinning linkages. Sri Lanka is engaged in high-end fashion garments, and of course this is where FDI, most of the FDI is coming. And India is an emerging supplier of textile spinning machinery, chemicals and dyes for textile processing. So if one look at these 4 countries and one try to see the supply chain of textile and clothing sector, all these 4, they have their natural advantages and they can fit in very well. Similarly, with this India-Sri Lanka bilateral free trade agreement, again, we found that there are opportunities for Sri Lankan producers to be part of Indian supply chain, especially in tires and tubes, in aluminium, tools of base metal, electrical machinery and equipment. And then study from ASCAP, enabling environment for the successful integration of SMEs in global value chains. And again, you will find quite a few very relevant recommendations for South Asia. Now, most of this literature, it tells us that in South Asia, there are some existing supply chain, some success stories, especially in textile and in staple food. And of course, at more national level, we saw that certain supply chains which are beyond South Asia. For example, Sri Lanka succeeded in supply chain of rubber and electronics, Bangladesh in plastics other than textile, and Nepal in ginger and coffee. So these are again some of the global supply chains where these countries they are member of, and of course then they can get benefit how to turn it into part of regional supply chain. These are some of the papers that we have quoted in the final paper. But most interesting is that why we don't hear many success stories on regional value chains. And again, some of the work that was done, and you will find some very common points. I cautiously just tried to choose the last 5 year studies to present here. So they are telling about this investing in logistics infrastructure, as Dr. Rajive Kumar very rightly pointed out. Again, transport and logistics, inflow of FDI, allowing inclusion of small and medium enterprises and ease in cost of doing business. Our very own Bhattacharya, he pointed out on why LDCs they can't get benefit of being part of regional supply chain, physical transfer of goods and security of supply chain, and customer satisfaction. So these are some of the things, and next 5-7 minutes I will just ponder upon these factors, how we can bring a change in these factors to have effective supply chain at a regional level. And then of course there are some gaps in the literature, so this is perhaps the way forward, some of the work that needs to be done. There is very little on role of regional value chain in direct poverty reduction via job creation. So of course, while we find a lot about infrastructure, about logistics, but there's very little literature that can tell us examples. For example, in Latin America and in Africa, when the producers, the food producers, when they be part of any fair trade organization or organic food suppliers, so it has a direct implication or a direct effect on, positive effect on poverty reduction. But in case of South Asia, we have very little written evidence, documented evidence of their positive effect on poverty reduction. Then of course making value chain resilient in the face of future economic downturns, and linking South Asian value chain with the counterparts in Central and East Asia. And the last one is customized competitiveness, and I'll tell you towards the end what does it mean, customized competitiveness. But if we focus on the hardware, on the infrastructure and logistic part, and I will not repeat much, but you can see that in logistic performance, it's the Pakistan and India and Pakistan, which are the top two performing countries. Then if we look at the custom scores, you will find that it is Maldives and Pakistan. If you look at infrastructure score, you will again find India and Pakistan. So it means that somehow we need to explore how these two countries they can take other countries along, and how these two countries they can actually work together to be part of supply chain to create a win-win situation. But these were some positive news. But if you look at for example the latest ranking on doing business in South Asia, you would find the red marks are where a country has scored the minimum score, and the green indicator is where a country has scored maximum score in that particular category. And I deliberately blanked out some of the indicators which I felt that may not be directly relevant to regional supply chain. So you will find, for example, ease of doing business. Both India and Pakistan, they stand nowhere. Sri Lanka has with 85% score is the highest performer. In starting a business, again, India is the one of the worst performer. It's Afghanistan actually, where you have the most ease of starting a business. In protecting investors, it's Bangladesh which has performed very well. In trading across border, it's Sri Lanka. And in enforcing contracts, it's Bhutan. So a sharp contradiction or sharp contrast between these indicators, where these countries, they have logistic performance, they have better custom scores, they have better infrastructure score, and comparing it with doing business, you will find that there is a very clear gap that needs to be filled in if we really want to take this regional supply chain agenda forward. Then the missing trade facilities, the documents to export and documents to import. And you will find that in many cases, you require more documents to import than to export. India, for example, if you have to import in India, you will in year 2013, according to WDI, we required 11 documents, and if one has to export to India, it required 9 documents. Pakistan, again, 8 documents each. So lot of bureaucracy and lot of this lack of one window operation, red tapeism, that prevails, and that is again one of the hindrances that many of the producers, especially SMEs, they can't be part of these regional supply chains. Then on top of the review of literature, we also interviewed 70 business entities across South Asia, from Bangladesh, India, Sri Lanka and Pakistan. We selected those firms which had current experience of trading in South Asia, and the senior management was interviewed so that we could get an idea of their engagement in regional value chains. Again, some of the issues that came out from our one-on-one interviews was that the transport network was missing in the region, logistic corridor either missing or entailing higher cost, informal trade which is hurting incentives for formal exchange, and then there are possible recommendations as well on top of, for example, on behalf of SAARC, if there can be some sort of single permit system for rail and road, as we have AIP, All India Permit. So perhaps that would be one of the movers and shakers in order to bring this regional supply chain agenda forward. Again, diversified transport modes across the region. This was again some of the recommendations that are coming from the business people themselves, not our recommendation, theoretical recommendation. Then facilitating agglomeration, lack of national level reforms in retail and wholesale trade, and heavily regulated distribution. Of course, if we don't have domestic commerce policy, in most of the countries you will find that there are export policies, but it's very rare to have a domestic commerce policy. Unless and until we have a domestic commerce policy, we have strong intellectual property right regime, and we have a promotion of domestic brands in which India has done comparatively better than other countries. Other producers from the region, they would have no appetite to be part of the supply chain. They would only be encouraged to be part of a supply chain if a brand is recognized in the producing country. If no one knows Haldiram outside India, then of course very few people would be attracted to it. But if Haldiram is a brand, ambassador brand in street, many people, they would like to be part of its distribution chain. So it's intellectual property rights and its brands that we are talking about. Trade facilitation for value chain development. So again, these trade facilitation reforms, transportation cost and compliance cost. Basically, we need to reduce the paperwork to make import and export more easy if we really want to promote these supply chain. Integrated border check posts, they are missing at several border points throughout South Asia, and where they are, somehow the process is too tedious and too bureaucratic to make the best use of them. And similarly, the private sector, it is private sector who would lead this regional supply chain forward, and private sector is not very happy with public sector's lack of engagement. So many a time both of them, they are working in their own silos. There is one memorandum of understanding, and there is one part of declaration in public sector, and then the private sector, they have to do everything on their own. And I think unless and until we have a public-private partnership in such cases, where at least the public sector become a facilitator, it would be difficult to work on this regional supply chain. And finally, it's the NTBs, non-tariff barriers in trade are already known at sectoral level. We also know the how they are hurting the value chain and development with the lack of human resources. So all issue of mutual recognition of qualification, the certification, the standards issue, unless and until we start working on it, and then of course the visa issue, which is broader than trade level. Just to give you an example, I am perhaps one of the very few Pakistanis who have the best of the best visa for India, 1 year multiple for all over India, no police reporting, no city restriction, no mode of entry, no port of entry. But even I have to fill at least 7 forms when I start entering from Wagah border to from the port where I enter to the point when I come out, and most of it is handwritten, so it's not computerized. So every time they have a register, I don't know if anyone bothers to go through those registers at all, and then the person deputed there, he starts reading the passport, and sometimes you find it difficult from where to open it. It takes at least 2 hours to cross with all this privilege that I have. And then I think that if those who have to have this police reporting and residential permit and all others, how difficult life would be for them. So I think we need to work on it, on these NTBs, which are trade related and also for the trade plus. And now I come to the very final part of my presentation, which is dynamic features of competitiveness. You see, there are quite a few approaches for competitiveness. There used to be a traditional approach where the producer, they were working on reducing the cost of production through greater farm or processor productivity. Then came the new traditional approach where they started reducing the cost of transaction. And now is a modern approach, go beyond cost competitiveness, by enabling economic actors to respond to changing incentive and condition in the market. And I would say that India has done quite good in this modern approach. Sri Lanka has done quite well in it. And the final is the customized approach. And in customized approach, you don't have to physically ship to France in order to export to France. All you have to do is to be part of Carrefour supply chain. And Carrefour's, we know for this region, their regional procurement hub is Dubai. So all we have to do is to export our goods to Dubai if we want to export to Carrefour. So we need not to follow the style of East India Company where we take the shipload of our commodity and start finding a buyer in France. Similarly, Macro and Metro, they have the regional procurement hubs in Bangkok. So all one needs to do in order to export Germany and Netherlands is to be part of Macro and Metro supply chain, send it to Bangkok. And the thing that matters is ensuring quality and quantity. While we were trading on a positive risk basis with India, even then the Mercedes distributor in Pakistan, Shahnawaz Group, a very well-known automobile actor, they were actually getting their spare parts from India. So and it was not official. So without knowing that the parts are coming from India, all the Mercedes users in Pakistan, they were availing the services and they were availing the product which was prepared in India. So this is the beauty of customized competitiveness, and perhaps this is one of the missing link that we find. So what needs to be done to bring this customized competitiveness? We have to understand the changing modalities of sourcing. We have to compete on cost, we have to compete on quality, we have to compete on suppliers organization, remaining in horizontal alliance by producers, and competing on volume. So these are some of the issues. So it's quite multidimensional, and in order to do it, one has to strategize it that the firm, they should be able to invest. So the competitiveness, no more about saving. Being part of value chain is no more about saving, it's about investing for a better turnover, for a better profit. So now they have to invest for market intelligence capital, they have to invest for invest in organizational capital, in technological capital, and financial and risk reduction capital. And this is again some of the things which we found are missing. And the conclusion is that we need to invest, and we need to invest collectively in order to remain competitive in regional value chains. And of course, we need to expedite SARC level pending agreements on transport, energy, connectivity, and dispute resolution. Thank you very much.
Thank you, for that very rich presentation. I just have 3 brief comments from what my takeaways from you. One is, of course, that you hinted towards that unfortunately supply chains in South Asia go via Singapore and Dubai, and we need to change that. And this is, I think, your reference to Mercedes spare parts. So that's, and for all the sort of thing that you talked about, the visas and the customs and the procedures, etc., etc. The second thing that I would want to say is that while all your suggestions for the private companies are very well taken, this will not happen until the preconditions for trade and investment exist in this region, and that's kind of summed up in your slide on doing business survey and the logistics, etc. And the bad news is that India slipped from 134 to 142 this year. So, and I don't know what's happened to the other countries in the region. So that's, so I'm really just saying is that until this gap between the delivery of public services and the rationalization of public procedures on the one hand, and the private sector's desire to trade and invest wherever there's an opportunity, until that, that gap becomes smaller, I think, value chains will not come up. And the final thing that I just wanted to point out was that this logistics, India is scoring 3.8 odd on a scale of 5. I wonder what that benchmark was. So I mean, I don't know whether that was a benchmark created only for South Asia, or was it an international benchmark. So that's something that I think it was a regional benchmark. So there you go. So I mean, of course, then we are better than the others. In some sense, I can't be sure of that. So there you are. So thank you very much. Our next speaker is Dr. S.K. Mohanty from the Research and Information Systems, New Delhi. If you would please stick to the time. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. This is a very comprehensive paper which has covered a lot of issues, specific issues, as well as you have covered both Southeast Asia and SAARC region to a large extent. Also, you have brought out very clearly about the constraints that the region is facing. But I have got few comments on your study. From the literature, one can see that if we look at different studies related to FTAs and regional value chain, one can see that regional value chain could be much better than that of any process through FTAs. Various studies done by ADB, SCAF and also in India, showing that under any comprehensive economic partnership agreement, it could be the gains could be between, additional gains could be between 2 to 4%. But if you take the other route of regional value chain, it could be 10 to 20 times higher than that of ordinary comprehensive economic partnership agreements or FTA. Now, for regional value chains, a production can take place in a single production block, or it can be fragmented to many, and the main motive behind that is to reduce cost. So the production blocks are again linked to service links, and therefore it again the whole issue is about the cost that will determine the level of fragmentation that any producer can take it up. Mathematically, one can see that under different alternatives, type 1, type 2, type 4, you can see that how you, when you move from a complete single production block to multiple production block, then the share of services will be pretty high, and in each case, if the cost will decline from type 1 to type 4, I think one can go for more production fragmentation, and it will stop when the cost is not effective, and that is shown in equation 4, that as you go for more fragmented production, then the share of service sector could be quite high as compared to the production blocks. So this gives the idea that there is scope that still production fragmentation can move from Southeast Asia to South Asia if they found to be cost effective. I think in the paper one thing is missing about the strong intervention of government in value chain sector. When we talk about regional value chain sector, it is mostly the affairs of private people. It is the SMEs and the MNCs. They determine the production and the distribution chain. But the government is very much required because many things which private sectors cannot undertake in terms of reducing transaction cost, creating favorable business environment. So there are various areas where government intervention is very much required to foster this particular process. A study was conducted by RIS recently with the support of ADB. It was 4-country study, and it was a multi-sector study where it showed that the region has a pretty high potential to go for a regional value chain in different sectors, which is ranging from textiles, apparel to food processing, automobiles, pharmaceutical, traditional medicines and IT softwares. Now, this is the current status of regional value chain, particularly in the area of parts and components. I think most of the lead economies in the region are engaged in this process, but the magnitude of trade in this particular segment is pretty low. But for this, it requires a very liberalized system. If you look at ASEAN countries, particularly in the parts and component sectors, the average tariff is coming less than 5%, but it is quite high in the same segment in South Asia. So, if you look at the trade potential in the sector, particularly in South Asia, and take the major economies, taking trade creation only, not trade diversion, I think the region has nearly $0.7 billion potential of parts and components exports to the rest of the world. So now the question is that whether we are competitive as compared to other Southeast Asian countries, or we are really very uncompetitive with them. This study is showing that India has got a lot of trade competitiveness in China, and India is again competitive as compared to many Southeast Asian economies which are supplying to China and other parts of the world. And therefore, if India can be competitive, I think many South Asian countries can emerge as competitive players in this particular segment. When we talk about liberalization, our benchmark is always China. The China is extremely liberalized. Chinese products are extremely cheap. In terms of liberalization, one can see that the region has really graduated fast in terms of undertaking liberalization process during the last decade. And if you compare between India and China, particularly in the manufacturing sector, India is more liberalized than China. And if you look at HS sections, out of 16 HS sections, India is having lower average tariff than that of China, and that is shown in this table. During the last 2 days, we have been listening that inter-regional trade is very low in this region, and this is the indicator which is showing that how this region is not perfectly integrated. I think this particular indicator may not be a suitable indicator to show that how the region is integrated. If we look at the region's inter-regional trade, which is represented by a green line, and region's overall trade with the rest of the world, which is represented by a red line, we can see, though they are put in different scales, but see the curvature of both the curves, that they are going simultaneously. It is clearly indicating that the inter-regional trade is not really going down. If you can put the volume of inter-regional trade and the inter-regional trade ratio, the volume has gone up from $5 billion in 1999 to $32 billion in 2012. So both inter-regional trade and overall trade of the region is growing, and therefore we cannot say that the region is not done much progress in this segment. And I can say that using ADB database, that So far, the region has 64 RTAs, whether it is a comprehensive economic cooperation or FTA, PTA, whatever thing. There are 64 different regional arrangements within the region, and the other regions are really eating away the potentials that the region has created within the region. What I say that why international trade, 2 minutes, okay, that it is not appropriate. It is international trade is very close to linked to the structure of the economies within the region. I have seen that during recession and before that, that some economies are continue to be having very high international trade, but others are continue to have low, not because of they don't have, they are lacking capabilities or the potential, but because of the structure of those economies. Here we can see that in South Asia, many economies are very strongly linked to the region. The share of international trade to the total trade is coming to be 60%. In Nepal, it is 61%. With Afghanistan, only the elephants in the room, one could be India or Pakistan. So now I have taken a simulation that if the original, the present situation is existing in 2012, the international trade ratio for export is 5.7%, international trade for import is 3.5%, so average is coming to be 4.3%. If where India has a huge trade surplus with the rest of the region. Suppose if now that India is not having any trade imbalances with the region, and whatever surplus it has generated has given back to the region, in that case international trade will go from 4.3% to 5.5%. And if whatever surplus India is having, now India will suppose think that the surplus is given back to the region, and also having a trade deficit with the rest of the region. If that is the case, then interregional trade will go up to 6.2%. So at any point it cannot go beyond 10%. So the last point I am saying that is it that is it possible that we can have a very high interregional trade like ASEAN 30% or so? Yes, it is possible theoretically. If in a situation where India's external trade is squeezed to a large extent, to the extent of 90% from the present level, then international trade will go up to 4.7%. If it squeezed to 10%, that means from $300 billion to $30 billion, in that case international trade can go up to 6%, which can never happen, and therefore the international trade cannot go beyond 10% in future. Thank you.
Is Dr. Keshav Das, Professor, Gujarat Institute of Development Research, Ahmedabad. Dr. Das.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. I have just a few points to make with reference to how we are sort of visualizing this whole idea of forming regional value chains, because the first question that comes to mind is how different this is from the global value chains or the global production networks. Are there sort of specific merits or demerits between the two? Are we sort of making a case for one more regional import substitution regime? Is that what we are talking about, or we are talking about very specific issues relating to the region, the South Asian region, where there are larger issues, structural issues relating to poverty, for instance. There are issues relating to informality in both production and labor processes. And of course, as the paper very nicely sort of points out, there are sort of issues relating to institutions, the constraints of the institutions, both formal and informal institutions. So are we referring to that is sort of addressing the issues of how to make the regional region more competitive, or we are only sort of talking in terms of sort of operating at a much lower level of technological advancement, and or are we talking in terms of being global subcontractors, as very different from being sort of brand makers, sort of having our presence, the regional, national presence in the global market with our own brand, with our own regional certification. Are we talking about that, or we are happy by being a subcontractor to a large number of global transnational corporations? I think we should be clear about that. The one question which definitely comes to mind is the kind of information we have, and particularly the GBC information that the UNCTAD 2013, many people are referring to. It's a problematic database, and it says very little in terms of the coverage of the countries, and also it doesn't tell us anything about activity-wise, the TNC-wise, and the subcontractor-wise information to us. So the GBC database, I think, needs to be redone with reference to, if you are talking about sort of promoting regional sort of value chains. I think we must be very clear about what kind of database we have, and also whether the information about, I think the very significant question about whether we have enough information regarding the Tier 2, Tier 3, Tier 4 maybe enterprises who are participating in value chains but not falling within within the formal contract regime. So these are the sort of broader issues. But what I would like to point out is even in a value chain, in a typical value chain, sort of where we are sort of typically we are sort of positioned. If you see a value chain, we are nowhere there in the planning and the design sort of process. We are not there in the post-production part, like marketing, pricing. So there is no deciding sort of component in the value chains. But what we are doing is mostly sort of contributing to a little bit of assembling, a little bit of manufacturing, little bit of processing, which is typically labor intensive, or we are sort of contributing to the raw materials. I think we must have a very distinct idea as to what we are talking about. Like, we're not talking about regional value chains. Are we talking about sort of having a production process which is equally competitive? Are we talking in terms of building technological capabilities within, or we are sort of just looking forward to be happy with working for a transnational corporation? I think that is a significant point to make. And the next thing I wanted to mention again with reference to the database that we have for ourselves, like what kind of information we have about the micro, small and medium enterprises, for instance, who would be very considerably participating in these value chains. What kind of database we have? Do you know much about how big is the informal sector, for instance? Do we know that what is the contribution a large number of MSMEs make to the production processes? And have we ever thought in terms of mapping the resources we have, whether it is natural or physical resources, including the skills, whether we have sort of thought in terms of mapping institutions, both formal and informal, and what kind of market access is possible. I think that mapping is equally important as we are talking about sort of concerns about building up infrastructure, for instance, sort of easing sort of processes of export and import. I think beyond that, we should have what kind of resources, institutions and markets. I think a mapping by country and in the region is very significant. Personally, I have tried it for industrial clusters for the Asian countries. I call it cluster grid, but anyway, that's not what I'm sort of focusing here. And the other thing relates to some of the very region-specific issues so far as the production process is concerned. One specific question which often we neglect and we never like to mention while we are discussing value chains is the whole question of labor. And sort of what kind of, are we also talking about social protection issues? Are we talking about skilling them? Are we talking about training them? And are we also talking in terms of the upgrading both economically and socially of the working population who are engaged in the production processes? These are very, very important for us because that is where I think the strength of regional value chains would lie, and maybe we can make a very special case for this. And the other thing which we may have to again take note of, the existence of varieties of technology skills as in these South Asian countries, and so whether we are able to make a special case, special case for promoting certain kinds of traditional skill-based, traditional resource-based, whether it's a traditional healing, traditional medicine, or certain kinds of food processing, agro-processing. I think woolens, garments, leather, and a large number of such products in which we may have a very special niche skills. I think is it that which we are trying to promote. And one last thing is relating to learning from a variety of other Asian examples of like how to promote the markets, like the one village, one product strategy by Japan, for instance, one tambon, one product idea from Thailand, for instance, market platforms as developed by the Chinese, linking the distance markets, distance producers with the mainstream market, and these are the issues that we must focus on, apart from the significant issues of infrastructure and other trade-related issues. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Dr. Das has made this very good point about not working for transnational corporations, and I thought we were trying to talk about the development or the evolution of South Asian multinationals, who are going to work within South Asia and different countries, and I think global value regional value chains would lead to that. And the other thing that you mentioned about, what we want to do, whether we want to do agriculture or food or whatever, maybe we should start focusing much more on what GVC does for employment than for anything else. Whether whether they does it for brands, or we produce microchips or food chips, or etc. I mean, all those questions, I think in South Asian context pale before the importance of employment. And I think GVCs are a very good thing about employment. And I think it's the sort of thing that Dr. Soleri said, is that the mindset needs to change from imports being a bad thing to also, GVCs not being good if they are not going to give you microchips, or if they're not going to give you auto components. I think those mindset changes required. I just take this opportunity to point out two things that that I want to take an issue with Dr. Mohanty, which is this his, in my sense, rather pessimistic thing that intra-regional trade cannot increase more than 10%. That conclusion that you arrived at, and which is, and I think, and I would, and I'll ask the audience to focus on that methodology, which is why he's saying that until India squeezes its international trade from $300 billion to $30 billion, the share of regional trade would not increase. I think it's a fascinating issue to talk about. My own thought was that the entire region could get more open, and its share of trade in the GDP could become much larger, and that is what would take us toward the much greater intra-regional trade issue, etc., like Europe did in the post-war areas. So I'm intrigued by that, and I think I'll come back to it in the question hour. And the second thing that you surprised me with was, and I'm sure the facts are with you completely, which is that India's manufacturing sector is more liberal than that of China. I'm sure, as I said, your facts would be with you, but I'd like to go back to that table that you showed about how we are less protective. then given the fact that we have the highest number of anti-dumping cases in the world today, I don't know what. So those are the two issues that I would come back to, and especially on the first one as to why can't the intra-regional trade go beyond 10%, and you did a very wonderful optimistic job of putting two scales and showing that intra-regional trade is rising as fast as the overall trade. I mean, then in that sense we can build optimism everywhere. The question was to intra-regional trade to rise much faster, for that share to increase, if we want intra-regional trade share to increase. Ladies and gentlemen, those are just thoughts on the last two papers, presentations. My great pleasure in inviting Professor Rajive Raichaudhuri, the Head and Center for Advanced Studies, Jadavpur University, Kolkata. Professor.
I first thank RIS for inviting me here. And you know, one thing is, if you listen to whatever is being talked up to this, deliberately I keep myself off from that, because otherwise I cannot speak my own things. So what I want to say, I have very you know, pointed things so that I can keep my track. If we take the cue from Southeast Asia, which showed that what intra-regional, not only intra-regional trade, but GVC, global value chain, can perform. The example comes from Southeast Asia. And if we look at that, the GVC process did not start or wait for bilateral treaties to be signed. That's my first point. Private sector took advantage of the general liberalization of investment climate. It's not country specific, general liberalization. You took advantage of that. It might have started from US multinationals, but then second tier, third tier, finally you have Malaysian multinationals taking advantage of Thai labor, or Singapore multinationals taking some advantages, as Dr. Kumar was pointing out. So the ball might have started from the West, but it percolated, did not wait for treaties. The private sector goes by its own motive. Comparative advantage, if you want to say that, dynamic comparative advantage, whatever we can call it. So that's the way things proceeded. What ails us in South Asia, I think, is something funny. If you look at Indian story, fast-moving consumer goods sector, FMCG, you have multinationals and you have value chains. So many small and medium enterprises all over India is producing for different companies in the FMCG sector. The point is, would they locate it in Bangladesh, Nepal, or Nepal? Yes, some. What's the percentage? What really matters is a credibility issue, a credible commitment. All these issues of logistics and infrastructure, I will come to that in a moment, certainly important. But again, that mindset question comes back. After all, if within India, automobile sector, electronic sector, fast-moving consumer goods sector has a clear value chain going on within India, and then some of these like leather, even textiles and electronics, you have connected to global value chain. But within the region, the Southeast Asian story doesn't hold. Although we have liberalized, all countries has liberalized the investment climate, the advantage is taken from by others. We still look at somebody else from outside the region will come, will supply to that, but within the region, the value chain doesn't really succeed. And if you look at the success story, so Southeast Asia, the parts and component story, it succeeded like anything. I think it's about 52% of their intra-regional trade. And import component of export has gone up. And they have realized it's nothing bad. It's not the import substitution or import dependent story of the yesteryears of 70s and 80s which India and South Asia did. That story is gone. It's a new story which is coming in. And we have to look into that kind of a story of parts and components import component going up in export is not the old story. That mindset has to change. I'm sorry to say that this mindset is still very prevalent in South Asia. I visited, several countries. Maybe one country is ahead of others in terms of liberal attitude, but in general still this kind of thing exists. The second point is, as is clear, that if you want to increase the fragmentation or vertical integration, as you call it, layers, service link is very important. And as we know, at least Several countries here in South Asia are very strong in services. They are growing stronger in services. But the point is, service sector liberalization, which goes along with this fragmentation, it's not the Southeast Asian story. They are strong in manufacturing, but we are strong in services in many areas. But are we ready to liberalize? We made study of yarn going from Ludhiana to Dhaka. Transportation. Are you do you seriously believe that this transportation network will be liberalized and we can really make it very quickly, apart from logistic questions? Financial, LOCs, which this credit is given to these producers in different countries, still depend on local banks. Far to go, and these are all called service links, and we should exploit that. That's also part of our, this story of value chain. Value chain is not only parts and component in manufacturing. We must factor in the services where some of our strength lies. We really haven't gone far into that. We shouldn't wait for whether WTO succeeds in the services. We can do it among ourselves. It's easy to do because we are contiguous. And gravity modeling and all this which people do very clearly shows that contiguous countries have a great advantage in this kind of activities. The third point, very clearly, is the SME question, small and medium enterprises. After all, as I said, in India, if you look at the FMCG electronic sectors, some of the small and medium enterprises are really tapped into the process. They are there. But as studies have shown, like Kimura and others have very clearly shown, that if you want to be dragged into this global value chain, you need finance, you need risk-taking behavior. And look at the small enterprises here in India or Bangladesh or even Pakistan, I would say. Risk-taking behavior, finance conditions, many of them are so small enterprises. In terms of value added in India, they are 45%, 55% is formal manufacturing. But this 45% has so many enterprises, innumerable. Can they be, dragged into this value chain? I think it's very difficult because small, very small and tiny enterprises. Within India, it has done, I think in some other countries they have also succeeded, but dragging into the global value chain is still somewhat a far cry. So within the region, we might think about that, but again, the mindset has to change in that case. Just, I want to remind you of one fact. We talk about this logistics and we talked about, ICT and this digitalization of our custom stations and Petrapol, Agartala and all these Atari borders. If you look at these borders, so many people are involved in service activities, restaurants, transport, other kinds of repair jobs. What will happen to these people? In fact, we talk about welfare calculations, and I know CGE modelings calculate welfare gains and loss. They do not talk about distribution among groups. 1 minute? In 2 minutes? In 2 minutes I will make 2 points and we'll finish it. So within group distribution is so important. We talk about inequality, poverty reduction, welfare gains. As usually in trade, we always talk about the overall welfare gain of countries. That also may be questionable, but within the nation what will happen nobody knows. And I'm not sure whether the small and medium enterprises, so many tiny, also losing job with technology progressing, what will happen to these people? Dr. Kumar has pointed to employment issue, very important, poverty, inequality issues. That's really, these are all growing, imbalances is growing, mainly because of this factor. And if the global value chain has to do some good, some welfare enhancement, this subnational level, within the nation welfare distributions and compensation has to be thought about. Just calculation of welfare gain and loss doesn't really make much sense to me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, this word mindset has come now, I think, probably half a dozen times. Mindset has to change. Can we take up this challenge and answer the question in the next session as to how do we want to change this mindset in South Asia? Because that seems to be the key, as far as I can make out from everywhere. And, actually, the challenge has been taken up to some extent by the World Bank, who now have a project called the how to change the narrative in South Asia. And I'm a part of it. And I think maybe all of us can think about how to change this mindset, why imports are not a bad thing, why employment by TNCs is not worse than employment by national companies, and how you don't take advantage of the other, but you work together in partnership, all of these things. I think that would be a great thing if we could do it in the South Asia Economic Summit. And the second one that Jidava pointed out was, this thing about the welfare gains by groups. And I came across a wonderful situation when I'm now currently doing this project called India and Her Neighbors, where I'm trying to create linkages between India's border states and the countries across the border, that very often higher degrees of constraints at the border mean more welfare gains to the border state. Because all of that, services industries that you talked about, so if the number of trucks held on at Petropol increases and the days of that they are held back increases, that's when the local community gains much more. And the West Bengal government told us that why should we facilitate trade from India to Bangladesh, because what is there in it for us? Because after all, nothing comes to them. Customs duty doesn't come to them. Ashok Leyland trucks going from Chennai to to Bangladesh. So what? And if you facilitate that Petropol by creating a sort of a bypass, then even that's gone. Poor chaps. I mean, the poor shopkeepers can't get whatever they can't get. I mean, these are real issues on the ground about regional value chains. How do you tackle this? And the same thing would happen between India and Nepal, I mean, it's so I think it's something that we need to really think through. Next speaker, ladies and gentlemen, is Dr. Mohammad Razak, Advisor and Head International Trade Policy, Commonwealth Secretariat, London. Dr. Razak. As you like, sir. Absolutely.
Thank you, Chair. After all these presentations and excellent thoughts and discussions, it would be extremely difficult for me to add value. So I need to be a bit more strategic, and I'm going to focus on a narrow field within this discipline of regional value chains. At the outset, Mr. Chair and distinguished participants, I think that the relevance of trade policy in the whole discourse on the regional value chains is somewhat lost or not given adequate attention because we tend to discuss a number of generalized and across the board issues. I mean, for example, the issues of trade logistics, trade facilitation, these are of course important, and I'm not kind of undermining their importance, and they are also important for understanding the potential of regional value chains. But I think in that particular discussion, in that context as well, we need to look into the issue of the trade policies as well. And I'm going to share a few, not very organized at this moment, thoughts with you, and maybe some of these things can also be taken forward. Now, we all know that the global value chains is basically nothing but an extension of the regional value chains, all emerged in East Asian countries, and many of the narratives have already been shared with you. There are certain advantages of global value chains, and of course there are challenges as well. We all know the advantage, like we don't need to focus on the whole range of activities, the specialization need is not that great, because basically it's the fragmentation of task or production process that the countries are interested into. But the challenges on the other hand is that here essentially the scope of value addition is low. That's number one. And since we are talking about the narrow sectors, so the competitive advantage can be fleeting in nature. So what the advantage you have today, it might get lost because of other competitive forces. So, but despite this particular concern about low value added, most analysts, and quite correctly I would think so, they have advocated for the regional value chains or the global value chains, fine. But against this low value added activities, most analysts and economists, they would also like to see a process of structural transformation taking place. So like, economic development would mean that countries would move away from doing the primary activities into manufacturing and perhaps modern services sector as well. And there comes the whole idea of what is called the industrialization, and whether that is relevant in this world. I said this because ideally the whole objective was that we will see the share of manufacturing going up and the primary sector will go down. But globally it has now become a kind of major issue of discussion whether the industrialization strategy can be something that is going to bring in growth or development. For example, even in India, there has been discussion is that the manufacturing value added is kind of stagnant if you look at the various growth components within the GDP. So that has been the issue. So the point here is something like, to argue is that the global value chain led participation in industrialization could result in not very solid kind of manufacturing base. But having said that, I must say at the same time, I'm not kind of undermining the whole thing, but what I'm trying to find out, there can be the scope for policy measures that can strengthen the process. Early industrializers, they achieved something like 30% of their employment share in manufacturing. And then the late industrializers, that is Japan, to some extent Taiwan and South Korea, they could also match this figure. They had 30% of their employment share coming from the manufacturing sector. However, the recent industrializers, they are kind of struggling. For example, again, I can give the example of India. The figures are something like that. In India, the manufacturing employment began to lose some kind of ground after it achieved its peak around 13%. For Brazil, another successful country, as you kind of seems to think so, was the figure was 16%. For Mexico, 20%. So as Dr. Kumar, in China, it achieved more than 35%, but now recently it is coming down. So as Dr. Kumar was quite rightly pointing out, this issue of employment effect, I think this issue then needs to be taken into consideration very seriously. And I'm going to point out, like, what is the scope for trade policy issues here. Now, so the fundamental point is the industrialization as a strategy for achieving growth and employment may run out the steam of steam. And in this context, one policy issue for South Asian countries could be to establish and promote the manufacturing value chains. Of course, we have heard the argument for promoting services value chain as well. I'm not kind of undermining even that potential, but what I'm saying is that in the context of South Asia in particular, there is significant scope for generating manufacturing value, and I'm going to give some example. The general finding from the geography of international production network that we have seen, and it is quite clear in the context of manufacturing, the whole regional value chains or the global value chains are kind of regional phenomena. Baldwin famously mentioned about three factories: Factory Asia, and he meant essentially East Asian countries, Factory America, and Factory Europe. So the question is whether South Asia can build another factory based on, I would say, more kind of manufacturing activities. And here essentially, I would like to consider three particular sectors: textiles and clothing, leather, and automobiles. Textiles and clothing and leather, they are extremely labor intensive in nature, and both the sectors have solid effect on employment generation and perhaps poverty alleviation as well. Now the question is, what is the empirical literature on South Asia indicate to us about these trends in two or three of these sectors? One issue we hear time and again, there is lack of complementarity, and we see some of these ex-post kind of data analysis. The issue here is when you do the ex-post kind of data analysis, many potential sectors cannot be taken into consideration. So we don't need to take those findings, to be honest, very seriously. Then the other area is it a problem when all, or say some of the South Asian countries, they are exporting certain sector, whether you can have regional value chains in those sectors? One of the studies that we undertook and was highlighted this morning, and in that study we found that despite some of the South Asian countries specializing in textile and clothing, we found out that actually it is perfectly possible to build potential supply chains in particularly in textile and clothing sector. And I mentioned the case of the textile and clothing sector is because here currently the South Asian countries, they export about $75 billion. The global market is around $800 billion. There is competition, of course, but given the fact that this industry is quite well spread out and it is a solid base in 4 countries in South Asia, that can be one building block. And the other, there was another important point was raised in this case, was that we also need to take into consideration of the fact that there is this issue of the distribution of gains within the countries, sort of within the regions across the countries. Now here again, you see the way the South Asian situation is in context can be quite useful. There are LDCs that can access duty-free, quota-free market access, and there are certain other countries like in India, Pakistan, who could be source for investment in many of these LDCs. And thereby, there can be another round of boost in textile and clothing sector. I think that is about to happen, and part of it will rely also on the kind of trade facilitation measures and border measures that you can do. I've got 2 quick points to make. I can say I've got just about a couple of minutes left. The first point I would like to say is that the way the whole argument on regional value chain, global value chain has been presented, has been argued, and being advocated for, it has got certain concept. It gives me the kind of an impression that the old school of Washington consensus is coming into the picture, and the whole idea is that, okay, you forget about your all trade policy issues, just focus on trade facilitation, and that is going to take care of things. I think in the context of South Asia in particular, where poverty is an issue, where we need to be selective about the sectors that we would like to promote, there is the role of trade policy issue. One further comment on the services sector. I do understand, there is a huge growth potential, but at the same time, and many people are suggesting that even within the manufacturing, there is what is happening called the servicification, because now manufacturing is also dependent on services. So if that manufacturing growth can be, taken forward, then some of the services sector would also, can also be promoted. However, having said that, I must say that policies and support mechanism that are needed for manufacturing, to identify the sectors and then to provide some kind of sector-specific incentives. In the case of services sector, those kind of trade policies are very difficult to achieve. So I would leave those things for your consideration. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. And challenging the very concept of the regional value chains in manufacturing as perhaps not being employment enhancing. I leave it to the audience to discuss and debate that. Just to say that you are probably treading on rather risky ground in India, because here 2 successive governments have declared their objective to increase the share of manufacturing from 15 to 25%. Not that I agree with it in the sense that, not that I think it can be 10, but just be a little sort of, careful about going around saying this. Thank you so much about this, and you pointed out to the fact that services could be, are you saying that services could be a value chain?
Yeah.
That would be a very interesting discussion. I mean, if there is things like tourism and health and education, if there can be value chain that I produce the textbooks and you produce the teachers, well, why not? And somebody else produces the campuses. So let's see, maybe we can talk about that. Thank you so much. Last speaker, ladies and gentlemen, is Mr. Pradeep K. Shrestha, Managing Director of Panchakanya Group, Kathmandu. Finally, we have a business person. We'll listen to you with great attention, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Very good morning. Let me first of all thank RIS and the organizers for giving me the opportunity. It's indeed a great opportunity for the private sector to be here and share our views. We know that most of the speakers here, the panelists are all doctors, professors, and I'm the only guy with a simple businessman with no doctorate, but I have a little bit of experience which I like to share.
The most valuable.
Thank you very much, sir. The chair has been very kind, and I'm sure he's going to give me a little bit of extra time because I'm very close to him also, yeah. Okay, the world today is getting integrated into one single village. That's inevitable. And the country where we are in the SAARC region, I think it's a lot of challenges and opportunities we have, but we have never been able to capitalize that. The speed in which the countries are getting integrated into one single village, and a country like underdeveloped countries or developing countries, with the speed that we are doing, I think it is very difficult to cope up with the changes. But we have to face the challenge, and we have to tap the opportunities. So this is the rule of the game. Be it small or big, nobody is going to show the kindness. So strength and the capability to compete in the competitive world is a challenge for all of us. This SAARC region, with more than 1/5 of the world population, the world is eyeing, the East, the Far East or the Far West is eyeing South Asia as the future where a lot of opportunities are waiting for them. Unfortunately, this region has a lot of natural resources, financial resources, human resources. In spite of all this, having all these resources, the SAARC region has been the least integrated region in the world among the blocks that we see. In the process of globalization, I think the concept of regionalization came where one had to fight the global competition. And I think that's why the SAARC was built in. But unfortunately, it has a very low and slow start. And now we can see that some changes are happening in this region. And there's optimistic of rays of hopes with the new political leaders coming up in this in the region. Especially, I would like to mention Right Honorable the Prime Minister of Modi, who visited Nepal, and we could see, there's a changes, the feeling, the mindset, the attitude of the public, and I think the whole region has a big hope. So I think the way this SAARC took off, and in the last few years, I'm sure there's going to be a big change, and that is very well expected by the private sector. Private sector is always considered as the engine of growth, but to that, it is just that not a private sector can alone make a difference. I think the infrastructure, the mindset of the bureaucrats, the cost of transportation or doing business in the region has been very, very, very costly. If you see the statistics, the interregional trade in the SAARC is hovering around to 5 to 6%, and in the investment side, I think the investment is around 7%. And the cost of not doing business because of non-cooperation is nearly $80 billion. And I think the region is doing business within the SAARC interregional is around $20 billion. So we see there's a big gap. If you see South Asia, how they have progressed, I think it is not because they could do themselves, but it was their political commitment from the leaders. And I think the parity of development in that region among these Asian tigers were nearly same. But if you consider the South Asia, you can see that difference of haves and have-nots, and the difference in the size of economy is very great. No doubt, India has been a great, I think, opportunities for all the SAARC neighboring countries. And I think this is where we need to capitalize. It's not making growing wheat and making McDonald's. I think that's not only a value chain that we are talking about. I think we have to go one step ahead and see what was the SAARC Charter felt, how it was felt. It was sharing the values, sharing the benefits, and improving the livelihood of the whole SAARC region, people of the region. So this is exactly what it was felt. And I think in the context of the development, I think if you see the resources that this region has, yesterday also in the inauguration session we could hear that this region has rich and a lot of opportunities that we have never been able to tap it. I think it is time for all of us to get together and identify your comparative advantage of strength. There we can where we can focus on it. I think we have been very, very at times we feel that we want to only rightly. I think some of our doctors here rightly said that we were very concerned on about substitution of your import. I mean, it's not that every country can make a pin to plane. There are comparative advantage area we should focus. If you talk about Nepal, I think we have few natural resources where we can make a big difference, especially the hydropower sector. If the Middle East country could be rich with the oil under the water or the liquid under the earth, which can never be visible, and we have seen the liquid flowing over the earth and we have not been able to capitalize that. So this is where I think the difference that has to be felt and make a difference in the whole region. And we cannot grow in individual. And I think the one thing that we have to also understand that in the SAARC, especially in the South Asia, no individual country could do everything on its own. Everybody has its own strength, and there I think that's where we have to focus. And the attitude that we have been lacking, that needs to be changed. Importing a product from US would be less than $40, and just about 20 to 30,000 kilometers, and 1,000 kilometers down from South India to Nepal would be costing more than $80 or $100, you know. So that you see the cost of transportation, cost of doing business in this region. So and there are a lot of other, because of the lack of infrastructure, industrial infrastructure, social infrastructure, administrative infrastructure, the cost of doing business in this region has become very, very high. But that is not the end of it. If we get together and identify our areas where we can, you know, strengthen our development, I think it is not impossible. The only thing is that we have to work together and to feel the feeling of, you know, the near and neighboring countries. And I think the way, like I would say, India, in the context of IT or beauty, I think they have excelled everywhere, you know. So this is exactly where I think we have to see how this region can develop together, and to make a difference in this region, I think we have to grow. When you talk about value chain, I think, I mean, it is just not, as I rightly said, as I told you, that just growing maize and you know, making a cock or a popcorn or a cornflakes is not the end of it, you know. What is the strength of an individual country? That needs to be identified, focused, and everybody, every neighboring country should feel that it is high time that we grow together to make a difference in this region. And in the context of the political dynamics that is changing in this region, has brought some hopes of RIS, and I think the way that especially when our Nepal is hosting the SAARC Summit in the end of this month, I think a lot of expectations are coming up, and there has to be a lot of declaration that I think we could hear yesterday, and I'm sure that will bring a difference. If you see the South Asia, with their growth from, you know, in 2003 or in 1990, and around 1990, the investment and I would say the trade liberalization from in the SAARC, I would say in the South Asia, it was just $12 billion. In around 2003, it went up to $130 billion. And we can see that when you say India has an export of 300 and import of $500 billion, there is still a trade deficit. And I think it's time for us not to just limit ourselves to growth of, say, $10 billion, but I think it's time for us to see much above and on top of that. And I think with this, the way that we have worked, now I think the value chain, you know, we are talking about outsourcing and also, you know, locating an idle place. 2 minutes. Yes, thank you, sir. And locating an idle place to make our product most competitive. And I think the way that we have worked, I think it is time for us to make the feeling of you know, growing together and helping each other for a you know, better tomorrow in this region. So this 1/5 of population has a lot of opportunities, a lot of you know, ideas, and the resources that we have underutilized is the main challenge for all of us to go ahead. Thank you, sir.
Ladies and gentlemen, I have done a reasonable job of timekeeping, and therefore we have precisely 7 minutes to the end of the session. So that's how it's been planned. So let's take a very short, brief comments, and I can see 4 hands already, and they'll be the 4 that we'll stick to. But please keep it short. Thank you. Yes, Mr. Ahmed.
Thank you, Chair, for giving me the floor. Thank you, Chair. I would like to request Dr. Razak to clarify one issue. I think there is a tension that emerged from his presentation. One is that the regional value chain would require, you know, division of labor sort of according to competitive advantages. On the other hand, he also rightly has mentioned about the desire for transformational changes and structural changes within countries. Now, if you take that, and then at the third point, he mentioned about the role of trade policy and industrial strategy. Now, trade policy and industry strategy at what level? If it is at country level, then you have a contradiction with the logic of the regional value chain. So, how do you resolve that? Thank you.
Mr. Shafi. So.
I am somewhat puzzled.
We all are.
By the statements or concerns expressed by yourself, Mr. Chairman, and also another economist, and this we have heard last few days as well, about the welfare gains for the local community, how they will be affected if we move towards automation or if we move towards more efficient forms of customs clearance at the border. On the one hand, we are also hearing presentations about how reducing clearance time by 1 day at Petropol can improve competitiveness and therefore enhance trade. But on the other hand, we are also hearing arguments that maybe it's not a bad idea to keep them waiting.
No, you got it.
I would like greater clarity on, which is why I'm coming to that, because yesterday there was a suggestion made that at Bore, Myanmar border, a carrier goes across to the Myanmar side, buys a kilo of har dal, the differential cost is 10 rupees, she comes back, and that is welfare for her. Now, if you broaden this argument, then you encourage a totally different system of customs clearance, where informal trade will persist. And informal trade and formal trade, the two systems are different. The culture is different. They cannot coexist. This is important. So, in short, I would like greater clarity on this, because I think we should move towards automation. There should be a clear message, particularly from the economists. And only then the administrators and the politicians will take cue. But if there are differences amongst us about how we should move forward, there's a problem.
That's a big hope to have no differences between economists, but nonetheless. Vipul, quickly.
Thank you, Rajive. Vipul Chatterjee, Cuts International. I will be very brief. I mean, we economists are always try to complicate things, and let us not do that. The fact is that regional value chains do exist in South Asia. There are several examples. Unfortunately, we didn't get too much into those examples. I can quote several examples, but because of time, I will not do it. There are regional value chains in textiles, in leather products, in pharmaceuticals, in automobiles, and many other sectors, including in tire manufacturing, which is coming up. All of them are private sector led. And therefore, the role of private sector in regional integration, that needs to be much more looked into. We need to do case studies of how those sectors, how those manufacturing companies are operating their regional value chains, instead of just talking about these theoretical issues or analytical issues or talking in the air. One brief comment about services. I think that is where the future is. You see, services value chain. For example, there are 300,000 Bangladeshi citizens coming to India every year for medical treatment. That is official figure. Unofficially, 700,000 more are coming to India for medical treatment. So 1 million Bangladeshi citizens every year coming to India for medical treatment. Why can't we have a common medical insurance policy? That would facilitate.
From having a value chain. Yeah. Value chain would mean diagnosis there, surgery here.
Yeah,
so
something like that. Yeah. And common medical insurance policy, that would facilitate their treatment.
Thank you. Sanjay.
Thank you, Rajive. You spoke of changing the mindset, and I think given South Asian realities, is it one step at a time, is it a grand vision? If it's one step at a time, which is where I think most people would go, then I mean, I think this room, the people present in this room, shouldn't they be kind of ambassadors for that change? Changing the mindset is a long-term proposition. It doesn't happen overnight.
You know, I challenged them before you came to do that.
Sorry, I was...
just before you came in, I did that.
So, if it's one step at a time, then, you know, why couldn't this group, intellectual group and others, business and all, tell the positive stories as well? There's lots of stuff going on the ground which you know of, which is very positive. Why don't we ever hear about it?
Why do we only hear the negative stories of skirmishes or killings or, you know, and so on and so forth? The other point is, and forgive me for saying this because I now speak as an economist and I speak to my fraternity of economists. And I think this is a very important part of changing the mindset. So forgive me for being candid. Is that, you know, I think this fraternity of economists represents the global pool of knowledge in economics. So I think it behoves economists to represent that pool of knowledge, not merely represent the individual countries. Sometimes in debates we see, you know, it sort of becomes, you know, Bangladesh, India, Pakistan and so on. So if they can represent, this is a South Asia body, and they treat, you know, themselves as kind of South Asian economists, and then speak the truth in their own forum, in their own spaces, I think that is a very important part of changing the mindset.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. So coming back to the panelists, if you... Didn't see that. Pardon me, but also it's the organizers are going to.
Thank you, Chair. Professor Jim Roloff from University of Sussex. I wanted to take up 3 points in Dr. Razak's comments because I think value chains can help very much in generating employment, but I think you have not to be too fussy about where in the value chain you are at the beginning of this, because value chains are also a way of transferring technology and intellectual property which can be exploited. So that's the first point. The second point is not to look at raw materials production as of itself a bad thing. Two of the richest countries in the world, two of the countries at the top of the Global Development Index are Canada and Australia, both of them majoring in raw materials exports. Now there are problems with that, but all I'm saying is don't dismiss that. The third thing I would say is to pick up on what Bipul was saying. Services are really important. We've just been looking at the employment effects of trade and value added between Britain and the EU, and out of that we find that the sectors where we are most effective, 6 out of our top 10 sectors are services sectors, not manufacturing sectors. So I think there's a lot to be said for an economy like India, which has got really high-class services capabilities to really get into that edge of the thing. And that's services embodied in manufacturers. That's not just services per se.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Should I go from the left? Siddharth, do you have any comment to make? Let's be very brief.
Yeah, just one small point I'd be talking about is when I'm talking of either GVCs or regional value chains, I think what we must emphasize is the transparency in the contracting procedure itself, because otherwise the fires that took place in the garment factories in Karachi and in Bangladesh and no lead firms taking responsibility is a point in question. So I think that transparency is what we must focus on.
Do you want to say? Yeah?
Thank you, Chair. Given the time, probably I can't, give very elaborate answer. To be honest, it was part of my presentation that I thought I would share with you, but I couldn't do it. Briefly on the first thing on the conflict between country-specific vis-a-vis regional trade and industrial policy, if I could, I got it correctly. That is why one of the arguments that I was making, if you could link it to export-based industrialization and then consider the regional value chains in that direction, many of the things can be mitigated. For example, we have got the long list of sensitive items, and yesterday we discussed a lot on those things. Now suppose, what is the problem? If Bangladesh has got export-oriented farms, and that has happened in the past, then basically those exporters, they can obtain or procure raw materials from anywhere. We had the facilities of a bonded warehouse and being able to import raw materials, machinery at zero duty is fine. So those can be implemented when this is linked to export industry. So that is the point I was trying to make. So that's number one. Number two, the countries, some of the countries, if you look at the whole history of the development of the manufacturing sector, particularly governments and also the industrial strategy that took place in East Asia, There, they also have country-specific, support for many of the industries. Those can still be WTO consistent, and to some extent, the kind of position that India is taking in Doha round, for example, can also be taken, like when coming up with that kind of more coherent regional policy kind of strategy. And the same will follow with regards to division of labor as well. We know that's a problem, but I gave example of garment sector, where already that link to employment generation is established. It's all about how the individual countries, they can be at par with the, or going to be consistent with the regional policy, and do there some kind of a domestic incentive structure as well. Quickly on the issue of the effects on welfare and automation process, that is why the issue, that's what I'm saying, it's not only about trade facilitation, we need to think about the other policies as well. And here comes the role of the government. We have completely forgotten the issue of safety nets, for example, so there are those kind of intervention measures we also need to think about it. Quickly, one comment on Professor Jim Rollo. You have given example of Canada, Australia. Of course, they are successful, but look at their kind of, the population size and also the natural resource base. So basically, they benefited out of those. I don't think that particular model is going to be working in the context of South Asia. Even the natural resources that we have, it can be abundant, but when you look at the population that probably, that's not the route that we could take. I can go on service and productivity. Quickly on the services, the main problem is, sorry, one second, is that many people would argue that it is difficult to build supply chains if you don't have the manufacturing connection, and also sometimes some of the services components are not very productive. So that is also something that we need to take into consideration.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think thank you for the private sector concern that been shown by some of the friends here. We are the engine of growth, and let it be felt by the policymakers. And we want to make a difference. And this is exactly in the coming summit. I think the more participation of the private sector be there, so that I think the views and are more shared from the other different aspect. And I think the support and the concern and the optimism that has been felt for the private sector is a good concern for us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Chairman, you raised a question about international trade, and my response is that the region has got a tremendous potential to grow. But my point is that international trade ratio as a measure is not a proper measure which can really gauge the level of integration within the region. So that's why I said that international cannot.
What is the alternate measure?
That is left to the academic community to develop another measure.
Well, I don't want to deliver on anything because we can talk over the cup of tea if needed. But let's end with the note, economics starts with let us assume. So let us assume that we have already started changing the mindset. And so we'll be happy at the end of the day. Thank you.
Sorry, Ajitab, I'll have the last word. So we won't end there. And especially because Dr. Sheshadri has raised this issue. Mine was just an attempt to point out a fact which has come out empirically. And in economics, you're always talking about winners transferring some of the gains to the losers. So if you're cognizant of the fact that there is a community around the borders which benefits from border trade and delays and rent seeking, etc., then for those who want to automate, which must be done to make everything much better off and trade much better off, there should be some concern about how to transfer some of those gains to the losers. So that's a real policy issue which goes beyond what Vipul said talking in the air. So that's the first point. And second point is that we have to distinguish between formal trade, informal trade, which is smuggling, and border trade. And border trade can be actually drivers of growth in trade, and it can be expanded. So so that's the more a border sector. I just wanted to end by saying that talking about services is very good, but I think as Mr. Razak pointed out, we are talking about value chains in services, and how do we develop those? And that's, I think, is a good challenge for us to take. Ladies and gentlemen, I just want to end by saying that the issue, in my view, is the same for the region which concerns everywhere, which is this prevalence of these major deficits that we have in this region, which also affect, unfortunately, our value chain propositions. And these are well known, but I mean, I think they are critical. And that's the governance deficit, that's the infrastructure deficit, that is the procedural overkill in our cases, there is the mistrust, and finally the mindset. You know, so I think those are like generic conditions which will affect not just value chain but the rest of the economic development and chains, etc. And so I think what we need to think about is perhaps with due apologies to you, sir, is not so much about the role of the private sector, but as much as how can government provide the preconditions in the region for private sector to thrive, which it wants to do, and which it has been telling us and saying that we want to do that. So with those few words, ladies and gentlemen, thank you all very much. Thank you to my panelists, and thank you to RIS for organizing this. Let's give us a hand.